Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are joining us from. I'm Laurent Pions, the CEO of the Monaco Mediax parent company of the Monte-Carlo Television Festival. Thank you for joining us and welcome to Betting on International Co-Productions, The Path Forward, a collaboration of the PGA and the Monte-Carlo Television Festival. While international television co-productions are some 50 years old, they are now more prevalent than ever, helping to fill the increased demand for global content. This conversation is an examination of what's working in the space now and how it will evolve in the years ahead. I hope you will enjoy and learn from the conversation. As we close the books on 2020, a year in which we all have sacrificed so much, I'm filled with hope for 2021. I invite you to commune with the international television industry of the sunny shores of Monaco, June 18th to the 22nd, for the 60th Monte-Carlo Television Festival. But first, let me introduce my good friend, Vance van Petten, the National Executive Director and COO of the PGA. Take it away, Vance. Thank you.
Good evening, Laurent. My good friend of many, many years. Many of my members don't know is that the Monte-Carlo Television Festival was the first organization to recognize the Guild's vetting procedures for producers and eligibility for awards. And they've been a very good partner of the Guild for literally many, many, many years. So thank you, Laurent. And good afternoon to our PGA members on the East Coast, and good morning to our members here on the West Coast with me. I'm so happy to welcome everyone to this webinar of International Proportions. I'm Vance van Petten, National Executive Director and COO of the Producers Guild of America. And while I'd love to introduce all of our illustrious panelists, I'm going to focus solely on introducing our hand-picked moderator of today's webinar, Cynthia Littleton. Cynthia Littleton is co-editor-in-chief of Variety. She's been with that venerable entertainment news brand since 2007. She is truly what we'll call a veteran television reporter. Hopefully you've read her recent deep dive into CAA and the cross currents roiling the talent agency business, or her ongoing analyses of the new business models being forged with every new technological advancement streaming our way. Frankly, whenever the Guild faces challenging issues concerning television, we call Cynthia. And that's why we are so happy to have her here today as our moderator. Cynthia, take it away.
Thank you, Vance, for that kind introduction. And I just wanted to say I always love doing PGA events because it is truly a great organization of working people with drive and dreams. And there's nothing better. That's where it all starts in Hollywood. So I'm always honored. Thank you for having me. We have a terrific panel here today of true industry veterans who know this subject inside and out. And so without much ado, we have, I just want to introduce the panel and we will get talking about a very dynamic area of our industry. Just to start to go down the list here, we have Rola Bauer, President of International Television Productions, or MGM. She is coming to us from Munich. After Rola, we have Gareth Neame, Executive Chairman of Carnival Films, who is coming to us from a lovely home in central London. After Gareth, we have Jane Root, founder and chief executive producer of Nutopia, a very busy unscripted banner, who is in Washington, DC. And last but definitely not least, Christian Vesper, president of global drama for Fremantle, who is, if I was paying attention earlier, Christian is also in London, correct? Correct me if I'm wrong. Great. Well, thank you all for joining us. As Vance said, this is International Co-Productions. The international television business overall is exploding, and co-productions, which have been a big driver in this area for a long time, have been much more in demand, but also changing quite a bit in terms of the terms and how they come together, how the sausage is made through international co-production. So this is a very timely topic. Of course, there is nothing more pressing for any producer on the planet right now than dealing with how to get content produced in a pandemic, in a COVID-19 environment. But I thought I would like to start with this group. Let's talk about what the sort of the market dynamic was. What was the demand like and the opportunity to assemble kind of classic international co-productions? What did you sense the market was like just before the pandemic hit? So like take your minds back to January of 2020. My sense from talking to people that it was a bit of the Wild West, but also a ton of true opportunity because so much demand. Would anybody like to just kind of comment on what it was like just before the curtain came down in March?
Well, it was interesting in one way. There was a huge amount of opportunity, but there was also the biggest new entrants in the streamers were pretty much holding on to everything themselves. And they were like, you know, the huge new opportunities, but they were very much having a vision of we want everything. We want the world, at least in my bit of the forest. And I don't want to jump ahead to the post-COVID world, but for me, that's the biggest thing that's changed. And so I think just before COVID, for me anyway, in my world, enormous opportunity, but it was hard to see that with those new entrants where the co-production opportunities were.
Yeah, I think that, that from my perspective is, you know, we have companies globally that we're trying to set up co-productions with. And I think that there was a struggle always. It's never easy. It's always like pushing a boulder up a hill to find the right partners. But, you know, sort of echoing what Jane is saying, it has tightened. I think that what we saw during the last 9 months was the continued consolidation into big global platforms. And it was never easy, but it was a little bit clearer where you would land certain co-productions. And I think it has gotten a little tougher over the course of the last 9 months. And I don't know if that's COVID related or frankly, just the natural, where everything was trending in terms of, you know, obviously the Disneys and the Warner Medias, clients of ours that are in a different place in terms of the rights that they're demanding. That said, I think also at the same time, we saw opportunity because people needed more shows.
Right. Those confluence of events there. Rola or Gareth, any just basic thoughts on kind of what you were facing before we really got into the teeth of the pandemic?
I mean, it feels like a different life, doesn't it, January? But my memory of it is, yes, incredibly dynamic. Lots of opportunity, lots of ideas being constantly pitched, but also, and this came to an abrupt halt in February, but a sense that although there's a lot of material moving around and an insatiable demand, a sense that the big platforms were quietly, perhaps not so quietly, growing their business affairs departments, their creative departments, their global presence. And for those of us who are associated in a more traditional production model, you know, Rola and I and others who are with the more traditional studios, clearly there's a sort of phony war that's going on, and the tectonic plates are moving in this industry. And of course, that's all changed because of practical problems with COVID, but things were moving massively anyway. And it will be interesting to see when we come through the other end and when we've all been vaccinated and all of that. You know, like any war, and I see 2020 as, you know, the COVID thing, it's going to advance us as only a war does. You know, we're going to move on 5 years quicker than we would otherwise have happened. So it's going to be very interesting to see where we land come spring of next year.
I have an interesting, I completely agree with what my colleagues have said. I do, however, see one thing that has happened. Because of the streamers being here, a lot of the traditional platforms that are out there, that independent SVOD platforms, pay TV platforms, networks, they still, like Gareth said, they still need programming, like Christian was talking about, and Jane, whether it's unscripted or scripted. So what I saw in end of last year, beginning of this year, was that demand. And I only know co-productions. I don't even know what I would do. I think if I got 100% from a streamer, I'd probably be in shock. I'd probably go find another co-producer.
Just out of habit, right?
And I think what I do feel is part of the challenge that we were having and seeing streamers come into the marketplace was that we did, and Gareth's right, we did see that they were getting all of their studios built up internally. However, because they were there and because the others who've traditionally been there needing their own originals, I did see that we were getting a lot done before COVID and placing them on both sides of the pond, working with the basic structure of a co-production and having the ability to do many of them with the different, at the time I was at Studio Canal and finishing up my 8-year contract. And we had 5 different production companies, all busy working nonstop on co-productions. Now, and I'm jumping, but may I, Cynthia, since I'm the last? So I'll do this way and then pass it back to Gareth and the others. I would say that now I actually see in talking, and I've only been 6 months in this position, and I love the fact that MGM has given me the ability as a studio head to stay in Europe and be able to, because I'm not having that slightly arrogant approach of saying, oh, call me at 4 o'clock in the afternoon your time, because I'm only getting up then, because I'm in LA. I love the fact that we're doing it out of here. And we actually, again, we're seeing, because programming and originals are a need, and because not everyone can carry the full freight of the financing, there is even more of a need I'm seeing from the different players who are non-streaming players. And the streamers, of course, they need, but like Gareth mentioned, sometimes they want to work with the studios, depends on the creative, but they're not hungry or eager to work with the studios.
Do you think that has the advancement of streaming and the competitive pressure that the literal advance of Netflix and Amazon into Europe, into having feet on the ground, developing their own content, has that made it more challenging to do a traditional co-production where you have a big broadcaster from a couple of major Western European territories put some money together into something that can travel well? Is that traditional classic kind of co-production piecing a couple of partners together to afford something that no one of them could do on their own? Is that under pressure because there's so much money and so much pull in the market from the big streamers with their big checkbooks?
We're kind of finding right now, in the midst of the weird COVID world, we're kind of finding the opposite, oddly enough, with we're working for 3 different big streamers at the moment, and no, 4. And some of them who previously everything had to be completely owned by them are suddenly not. And that's because they're in a huge rush to get content. And they're like, we want more and more content, and they're prepared. And so when I heard about you inviting me to be on this panel, I thought that's a really interesting moment, because a few years back, we were in a situation where most of what we were making was 100% funded. And that's now changed. And that there's actually people who previously insisted on 100% funding are now like, we want more and more and more content. And that's led to opportunities. So it's kind of paradoxical, but the intensity of competition is actually opening things up. I can see Gareth, you nodding there.
Well, I think that's very interesting. And I think the demand suggests that, there is a huge advantage, again, in this COVID year. The practicalities of production are such a huge obstacle. If you can license from another producer who's going to take care of all of that, you haven't got the capacity within your own fledgling studio, but you want to go out to third parties. I can absolutely see why that's happening right now, but I still think, certainly from a scripted perspective, I think that journey is still really is very much going the other way, that they're massively open for business with producers, but they do want to own everything for obvious reasons. And I think those traditional, you asked the question directly to Rola, and actually she was the right person to ask, because Rola is the person I remember when I was an executive at the BBC working with Jane 20 years ago. Rola was the only person out here doing this kind of thing then.
Hey, cut out the years, stop.
Another thing that...
Only 10 years, but it really was that long ago, Rola. You know, that model of going around and piecing things together, there are other ways to do it now. There are people who write the whole check, but they want everything for their money.
I think that it's, you know, there is a capacity issue still, you know, with the big platforms building their capacity. And I think that there continues to be opportunities for our producers on that front. And I think that the working out of Europe, what's been interesting is we can make projects at a different price point, and that keeps certain opportunities open, even with the big consolidations in the US. You know, I've had various commissioners in the US say, look, if you can, you know, I can still do this co-production if you get it in for under a certain amount, say $1 million US. It becomes a different conversation for them. You know, they don't have to necessarily elevate it to a certain level where they're going to get the pushback saying, no, we need to own this. I think, you know, and the other tactic is, and I've seen this as this platforms have rolled out through Europe, producing with them is different than producing with the studio or with the traditional network, or a you know, a state platform, because, you know, it's a different level of experience, different types of executives, different expectations. And I think that producers, especially producers with a lot of experience, you know, will make that decision over how they want to work. And then that gives you a little bit of leverage, to be perfectly honest, because, I mean, we consider our producers our talent, and talented producers can be a little bit more demanding about the structure of how their shows are rolled out.
Mm-hmm. That's actually a very interesting point, that the adjustment of expectations and how a show will be marketed and handled, and what the plan is for shows. It's certainly something that the entire industry is dealing with in terms of how things are rolled out, and how, you know, just how marketing plans and how you're able to get behind something, or conversely feel like you might be one of 10 shows that might drop on a day, and if you don't get lucky.
I want to put in the future though, because I like this producers of talent. I'm not going to let that one go.
Yeah.
But really, I mean, I think that it's part of the arsenal, you know, and it's good producers make better shows than bad producers, or you know, I think.
Are you finding with the big streamers that all roads are still, you know, mostly roads to commissions and green lights mostly flow through LA or New York? Or are you finding that there are real kind of decision-making capacities in London, in Germany, in France now for some of the bigger players?
We're finding
in London, my experience, there huge organizations have been set up here, and with very real buying, commissioning, creative power.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Absolutely. That's what we're finding. I mean, we're having a big discussion with a streamer based in Italy at the moment, you know, and they very much have a lot of power.
I feel like it's taken some time for all of the streamers to get their people into place, and now it's actually, they are actually able to execute out of Europe, and which has been helpful. I think it's made the process much easier.
And that's got to change the complexion of what they're interested in, of just the demand of the types of material and even talent that they're willing to take a gamble on.
Well, that's been the exciting thing about the last 10 years, hasn't it? I mean, it really, that streamers or not streamers, it's just the appetite for global content. That's just been, I mean, for those of us who have been around for a few decades, Rola, you know, we used to always being the European in the room with no real interest. I mean, before, you know, 5 years ago, you couldn't watch British content in the US. You really couldn't watch the kind of dramas I produce on PBS. and some of the great factual pieces on equivalent, cable. But you bet you couldn't watch the great British comedies and the mainstream British dramas or anything. And that all changed about 7, 8 years ago now. And that's been the really exciting thing of this last decade and working in it, and why international is such, it's not just Rola banging on the door like she was doing and saying this can be done. It really is mainstream now.
Very much so. And sorry to cut in, Cynthia. I just wanted to say the exciting thing, to touch on what Gareth is talking about. I always say that we do foreign language as well as big English language. And I define foreign language by French, Spanish, German, and British, because it has a vernacular onto its own. And we never saw it for so many years other than in England. And then there was the anomaly. I mean, even when I was a buyer at ProSieben, I had one series from England and everything else was American. I mean, we barely, and now you see in Germany so many different British shows, but we're also looking to do the local shows. And to come back to your question about the streamers, they're empowered as well to push through these local shows. And that's quite exciting to be involved with that. So they've connected us. There's so many positive things about the streamers coming into the market. They've connected all of us internationally. We have started our own language, our own lexicon. And even if I found myself the other day watching a really cool new series, I don't know if I should be plugging anything here that none of us have actually produced, but a wonderful Spanish series. And I didn't want to watch it with subtitles. And normally I like to see the original. I understand a little bit of Spanish. I just said, oh, I'm tired. I'll watch it in English. And it was enjoyable, entertaining, is as good as any top double the budget television series you see today. Because you didn't need to have that big, huge budget. It was emotionally engaging.
Well, and I think with the streamers, what has continued to keep certain co-production opportunities open is as they expand into the local markets and are trying to produce local for local. We have noticed with various of our producers where they need certain shows for certain territories and aren't willing to necessarily foot the whole bill because they don't see a life for it on their platform internationally. And that has been an opportunity that we didn't quite expect. And has kept the model moving forward.
Christian, and in that case, do you get some flexibility to take it and sell it in other markets?
Yeah.
Or so that it's which of course again, obviously distribution is a huge part of our business. So it is important for us to search for those opportunities. And again, I think that we've all been doing this long enough, and there have been multiple times over the past number of years where there's been this push for vertical integration, and it always looks like it's the end. And then, of course, there are just so many exceptions to what people need and how they need to work. And I feel like that's one of them that we hadn't quite anticipated. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Jane, you were going to say?
Well, it's in the last 2 weeks, I've had a series of meetings with the BBC about a couple of different projects. And it's been very interesting to me to see the organization that me and Gareth used to work for, which was so focused on a schedule and slots for particular audiences. And also we were proudly kind of like, we were the BBC, we didn't need anybody, occasionally except for HBO, but we really were very certain. And now that, times have changed, and actually it felt like the whole conversation was different, and that there was a sense that they haven't not as much money as they might, but they're having to figure out a sense of partnerships, which felt very different. It felt like a new kind of beginning. But it's also that sense of leaving the schedule behind. I mean, there was one pivotal moment for me. I was walking out of a Netflix meeting. It was like the second or third meeting. We'd just done a deal on a big 10-part series, and the commissioner said, I was standing up to leave the room, and he said, we're paying for 10 hours, but, try not to make it shorter than about 45, longer than about an hour and 10 minutes. And it was like my life at the BBC, where I was like, could you possibly take 30 seconds out of that? Or my life at Discovery, where can we squeeze in a like 3.5-minute ad break? I felt like, wow. And that sense of openness was just really exciting, you know, really crazy.
Oh, as producers, I can only imagine. Let's talk specifically now about how much harder a very difficult job has become with all of the restrictions, with the public health crises and the pandemic. Let me start by asking you where you are now and where you think you're going to be able, what you think you're going to be able to do for, say, the first quarter of 2021. Like how ambitiously are you forecasting for something like business as usual in terms of what you need to shoot? Can you give us a sense of like how disrupted things still are for your slates?
Gareth?
I'm pretty busy actually, and although I'm here in London, I have 2 shows shooting, one in New York and one in Budapest. And obviously from a practical level, that's fairly difficult. I've been in New York for several weeks for the start of production, but having come back to London now, of course, I can't really get back there. Things have got rather worse.
Right.
And just selfish point of view, there's had to be a sort of, you know, with or without passports, visas and everything else, you still need a dispensation to get in if you're a foreign national. That's very challenging. It means quarantining when you get there, coming back to London, quarantining again, which was 14 days for me here in London after that. And so I feel like we are shooting through. I mean, obviously nothing was shooting through the summer when nobody really knew what was going on. And I was very fortunate that I was not one of those people who had 3 shows halfway through production and nobody knowing quite how they could finish, which I really felt for colleagues who were in that position. Some people had a week left to shoot. You know, they had 30 weeks of production and 1 week to go. I think it was pretty cruel. We were days away from shooting Gilded Age in New York. We were 4 days from production, I think. But I'd rather that than we were 2 weeks in and then we stopped.
Yeah.
But we got up and running in September, and The Last Kingdom is shooting again in Budapest, started shooting a couple of weeks ago. And we're just, you know, the same as everyone, we've got a whole new department that never existed a year ago called the COVID department. I've jokingly said I should have studied epidemiology at university because I always wanted to be a producer. And we're just sort of getting through it and spending large amounts of money on testing everyone day in, day out, crippling extra, a bit like on our governments really, crippling costs that nobody ever thought were affordable on a national state level also apply to the lines and budgets that would have been totally unaffordable that we're all now carrying.
Gareth, may I ask, who's footing that bill? Is that bill coming? Is that bill being built into the license fee? Is the producer having to shake the couch cushions? How are you? Who's footing all the COVID and the PPE and all of those unexpected needs?
My own experience is it really depends on what the ownership of that show is and where the vested interest is, and it's either anywhere between 100% or it's a split of the cost between you know, if the producer is the owner, you know, and you're licensing, there's usually split costs, and it really depends on I imagine the individual show, but that's just my experience.
We carried on shooting even right through the summer. We did a huge shoot with a global top 5 movie star in Iceland. We did another one in Australia, which was like 2 weeks quarantine in, 2 weeks quarantine out. There were people going crazy in their little hotel rooms in Sydney. And we're shooting today. We're shooting in 3 different shows today, but it's hard. You know, it's like every day there's a new thing. Like you can't, you know, shooting in California suddenly today is really difficult. There's a whole thing. There was a rule about we were supposed to be shooting in a hospital. And did we have the co-production completely signed up with the British broadcaster? Unless we had that, we couldn't film in an NHS facility. And we got that sorted out hours before we were supposed to start shooting, all of those things. And we set up a mobile lab for COVID testing in Iceland in a hotel basement. And we were doing 200 tests every 3 days. It was, you know, a huge undertaking. and just what you have to do. But yeah, none of us expected this. None of us did.
I mean, wow. It's been really impressive to me how our producers, who are all frankly hustlers, you know, in the best sense, you know, it kicked everyone for a minute. And I think we had 42 shows in production when this started, and about 95% of them have delivered, which, you know, is a test. Look, you know, we're in the position of shooting in various territories. So certain territories had different protocols and different costs and different government support. You know, it has been very territory and show specific, our experiences, but we are on track to deliver more shows this year than last, which I think is something that we wouldn't have expected in March. You know, but, you know, to everyone else's point as well, it's hard. And I think that right now we do struggle on certain of our productions when we're trying to lock the financing about where that last bit of, you know, COVID cost comes from. And if in certain territories, it can be up to 20%, which is really, I mean, that's only happened a few times, but it's a huge amount of money. And then at this point, I mean, we're in this strange position of, okay, we'll budget this. We really have to, you know, hoping that if by spring, we won't have to actually absorb those costs. It's just a lot of discussion and confusion. You can't plan very well.
And does the buck, in terms of the public health aspect of it, I got to believe that's a whole nother level of agita for you as a producer, being kind of, you know, being one of the people responsible for this public health. Does the, you know, does the organization of all that, creating the lab, doing the tests, does that really fall to the producer, to the exec producers, or the showrunners? Like, who takes ownership of that on a production? I would imagine it's the producers.
We did. We had to.
Yeah, our producers did, yeah.
You want to work with the risk assessment departments of whoever you're working for, and you have to keep everybody informed all the time. And like, you know, this week, a lot of conversations about what's happening in California. But in the end, you know, you've got to be there. Like, is everybody safe who's on set today? Is everybody, you know, can we plan for doing that? How, you know, right down to how do you film this sequence if, you know, your DP has to be 6 foot away from your star? And, you know, a lot of it's always the same, isn't it? It's 10,000 tiny decisions. And now it's like 25,000 tiny decisions.
I think the studios behind us and financing projects they have established great protocols during the summer. I think when we should do the shout out to the unions, actually, because they have really worked and collaborated, you know, very closely, and it does feel like it's everyone sort of shared this problem together to find a working solution. And I find on a complicated drama set, we are so adaptable. Human beings are so adaptable. Crews are so adaptable. For the first day on set with a mask, I just didn't know how we would get through the day. It's so uncomfortable and stifling. And actually, by the end of the first week, you're completely used to it.
Mm. And I think, to Gareth's point, the protocols are the most important part of just setting the guidelines for everyone. I started in this position in June, so I was looking at the slate that I was inheriting, but also looking at the things I wanted to get up and running. And we are budgeting a 10 to 15%. There are a couple of them where we think we need to go up to 20, but we're doing this now with the knowledge that next year, because we're closing the financing on a few of them with the plan to be in production in May, June, July, you know, but nothing before May. We have already set that. So we know the parameters, we know the protocols, and we have put that 10, maximum 20% on top within the budget. Whether, like Chris said, we have a windfall, great. We'll spend it on other reasons, or there'll be more profit later. But it's in that budget right now.
But 15 to 20%, that's not an insignificant amount. So that definitely gives.
We have one show where it's 30.
Wow.
Wow.
So that's filming all over the world and huge, but yeah, 30.
That's heavy.
Yeah, well, I think everybody is eagerly consuming the news of the vaccine deployments, probably no more so than people with broad slates. Do you think that, of course, one of the drivers of classic drivers of international co-productions were production tax incentives, production credits. Do you think that the pandemic times will accelerate changes there? In the US, there is definitely a feeling that some of the bloom is off the rose of tax incentives. You see a lot of states that had been very generous have been starting to reconsider some. I know there's an endless debate about what $1 of production generates in terms of revenue, but just from your experience on the ground, do you have any sense that tax credits, whether pre or post pandemic, are something that are still going to be very vibrant in Europe and other major territories, or is there a political, are the winds shifting on that?
We've had, there are a number of European, in particular, some of the Southern European territories where we shoot a lot. The tax incentives have increased, and really in a way that they've accomplished exactly what that was meant to do, where it's really forced our decision making in a good way. I, with the exception of America, I feel like that is something that will continue to be an attraction for us, and I don't necessarily see that they're going to be cut back immediately once people have to start paying off the costs that were incurred during the crisis. But I think that that's a bigger political discussion that I'm not quite. It's hard to predict, I suppose.
Mm-hmm.
I agree with that. Individual states will, when we come out of this crisis, will decide if it's going to be about spending less in order to cut costs to pay down the debt that nations have taken on with COVID, or they're going to spend their way out of the crisis, and individual nations will decide. But we as producers will simply move to whichever state we have. I mean, none of the shows I've ever made, and certainly, in the last decade, would ever have happened without these very effective, generous incentives in countries which have increasingly improved their film capacity and the caliber of the crews working there. And I would say to the representatives of countries is just keep that incentive up, keep it up. That's why if it goes down, then you just pull out. But even the next season, you do somewhere else.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And that's also a testament to just how mobile the both mobile people and facilities, but also just how the infrastructure that has been developed by these programs to seed local infrastructure in places that if you told people in Hollywood that North Carolina would be a filming hotspot 25 years ago, 30 years ago, they would have laughed. And now, and it did become. So I think that the idea that you can't, that you can actually relocate a show to Australia, Vancouver or Australia, if the incentive is right, is a testament to all of that work that has been done. And it sounds like it's, especially with COVID costs rising, it sounds like that incentive is going to be more of a lure and a magnet than ever before.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, we've always enjoyed shooting in Europe, Africa, South Africa. So, and all those incentives are there, staying there. It's no indication that they're going to be dialing them back.
Well, and I think to Gareth's point, what's been great about them, which has to be recognized, is the creation of crews in places, talented, effective crews outside of the US and the UK and Western Europe. It's we just did it. We've done a number of shows in Morocco over the last couple of years, and I had one American buyer question constantly if we were spending enough money, and but then it looked great, because the crews were really good, and we weren't underpaying them. I mean, it was just. And I think it would be a shame for those governments to walk away from those businesses that have been created.
We made one really expensive, complex show for a broadcaster several years ago, and a senior executive at that company watched a cut and they were terribly complimentary about it. And they said, it just goes to show I forget how beautiful America is. This show was 98% shot in South Africa. And we said, yes, because we did the 2%, just in case anybody ever said that. We were like, yeah, it's so, I said, yeah, it's so exquisite. It's so wonderful. And they're like, yeah. And like,
oh, America.
We wouldn't have afforded this show without the South African rebates.
Oh my God, that is so indicative of the global village in which we all live and in which you work. Speaking of the global village, we were talking just before the panel started. One thing that also always stands out to me about this business, the entertainment business, the content business, is as big as it gets, as many platforms as buyers, it's such a person to person. It's so about the connections that people have. A producer knows a writer, a director knows that a writer has long been fascinated by this subject. It's so much about, it's not something that can be put together, forgive me, by an algorithm. And you, just even on this panel, you all have connections. You've worked together on various projects. You've worked together at the BBC at different times, and undoubtedly other platforms. You've collaborated on projects in different capacities. Can you talk about, even though the international community outside the US is so big and so many buyers, about what it sort of working in international TV, that it is kind of that close-knit world of producers and financiers and things that sort of make it kind of a community, even though it is spread around the globe?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. No, I mean, that I love the fact that it is so intimate and so global, because it allows us to find out about each other's history and language and what we're looking for. And yet you run into the same people all the time. What the streamers actually, to come back to one other, because we sometimes criticize the streamers a lot, they actually brought in a lot of completely new, they took a risk with completely new younger people. And that was great to see. So, and I'm talking on the script level, the writer level, the taking the risk on new voices that we may not have met, or because those people also took a chance and started talking a little bit more, or a little bit louder. And that's an excellent thing. But I mean, I've been chasing Gareth for years, trying to work with him. Of course, it was impossible because of where he was. And Christian and I had the pleasure of working together. And it was wonderful because we were putting something together from Europe that landed in the US when he was running a network. And he had and I thank him for that, he had the foresight to see that this was something that, even if it was global and European, was going to transcend the boundary and work in the US.
Yeah, I mean, I think that those days were interesting in that I was at Sundance Channel, and frankly, we didn't have the money to do much of our own originals. And at the time, it was really before Netflix got into this side of the business. It was how we were able to have ambition. And I think that and it was something that I think people still do. I mean, you talked about BBC beforehand, and I still think, BBC is one of the gold standard broadcasters in terms of their taste and the value of their imprimatur. And, they can't just pay full freight for everything. I mean, we all know the state of state broadcasters, and it's important that we all, in this side of the business, I think, support, the ability of a BBC to continue to achieve their goals. And I think that, again, that speaks to the continuing value of co-production.
But Christian, when you were at Sundance, I think that you were involved in bringing The Staircase to the US.
Yes, that was a long time ago, yeah.
It's just an amazing show, which I think is one of those great projects in a genre which has since exploded. But that sense that at that time, the fact that you were going to do a multi-hour kind of crime story of a single French family kind of felt very surprising to American audiences. And yet it's symbolic, I think, of how far we've come, that something like that, you absolutely can see that. In fact, Netflix have gone off and done I think a further hour.
They did. Yeah.
And so that fluidity, I mean, for me, in all different kind of ways, that's the result of the kind of interconnectivity that Cynthia is talking about, the fact that people know each other. And it's now just on a much bigger scale. When I first moved to America 15 years ago, it felt like, wow, this was this really big trip. And that it was kind of crazy to be running a company. 10 years ago when I started Nutopia, it was crazy to be running a company in London, and yet I was staying here. But now it feels kind of like, yeah, I know people do it all the time. It doesn't feel strange.
You know, one thing, we're going to get to audience questions here in a minute, but one thing that I did want to touch on is how much also tonally the world has opened up. When you see something like Fleabag coming, and you know, something so specific and something that seems so British, so you know, so of that culture, but yet exploded in popularity. Something like Chernobyl, which was on paper, who would want to watch a multi-part narrative of what we all remember as a terrible event, but the level of impact that storytelling had, both on telling a Russian story that had broad environmental implications, but it was still very much a Russian story, and it just that it touched so many people around the world. That also has got to be, you know, as much of just an exciting opening of talent and content, and the ambition for what is possible. And Gareth, of course, you know, you're no stranger to sort of busting convention with, you know, who would have thought a costume drama on PBS would absolutely capture America and the world. Hard to believe, but going on 10 years ago, it seems like, and with so many outlets now, not just the Netflix and Amazons, but local streamers, local content exploding. It just seems like it is, for people with connections and a sense of really how the business works, this would seem like, despite the overlay of the COVID, this would just seem like a renaissance time for people that know how to put things together and have great taste, as you all individually have demonstrated.
Yeah, like you was saying about, you know, what was it like back in January at the beginning of this session, and we were talking about how things were changing so rapidly. But actually, all of this, of course, started with the rise of home entertainment, streamers. You know, we all remember, you know, as European producers, we would take all those meetings in Los Angeles, and people would say, "Yeah, but you only make 6 episodes," or you know, you just use the same actor every time, or we need show, you know, and the end, and obviously, I mean, the one part of the business that doesn't really ever get talked about in these things is the hugely important US network television business, which is still, you know, knocking out 22 episodes. That's all ongoing. But in our sphere, I feel that the idea of a single writer, you know, writing an authored 6 or 8 hour piece, which is what we've always done, and was really not really understood by Hollywood at all, has now become the norm. And actually, when you have a successful show, it used to be the case that people would say, well, how long can you squeeze it out for? You know, how much longer can this keep going? We want 10 seasons. But now it's the producer saying, well, we'd really like to do a 3rd season. It's doing very well. And everyone's saying, no, we're moving on to the next thing. So I think a lot of and Jane, you mentioned earlier on about the fact that we used to be I used to sit there in table reads, timing things to make sure that my episodes roughly were going to end up the right duration, which is, as Jane said, you think about it, it seems ridiculous now. So those things were changing, and the streamers have realized, of course, they'd much rather have a movie star doing 4 episodes and out, you know, and have the star than worrying about 20 years of syndication of all those, you know, where we monetize things has changed. But that said, I do accept there is still a network television business that has its model.
Mm-hmm. And the connectivity of what you're both talking about is actually great from the story point of view. I cannot say you mentioned Chernobyl and Fleabag. They're such different, but
right.
But emotionally, we were all so moved from the craziness of the dynamic of a young woman trying to survive today in the world of who am I, dating, my sexuality, everything that every woman goes through. And that's so exciting to have that vocalized and politically incorrect in how she did it. She was fantastic about that, very refreshing. And a lot of women could relate to it all over the world. So that was you didn't need a brand of a book, you know, she just went for the emotion, which was the connective tissue to all of us, I think, and transcended all the boundaries. And the Chernobyl is an anomaly that I think people forget. We're so connected by disaster, whether it's fire or, you know, all the elements of the earth. We are connected by that. And if you recognize that, and then you put in, and it was an emotional story. I mean, they made it very emotional in the way they entered into it.
Rola, you and I worked with Johan on his first show.
Exactly.
Show.
Yes. The Last Panthers.
The director of Chernobyl, Johan Strunk. Did I get it right?
Johan.
Sorry, not Strunk.
Yeah, he was the director of Last Panthers, the one we were just talking about that Christian and I were involved in. So it's so great to see him. Yes, and that's what I actually was going to say, the connectivity of it. Everybody was, and he did the first couple of episodes of Vikings. So everybody was like, who, what? He's so young. But the fact he could handle the 6 episodes of Last Panthers also made the bigger players put more money in his hands, and then he could do it. So it's a step-by-step building. And it
reminds me of this, and it is, I think the way it's been unfolding is it opens it up to a different kind of talent. And I think a lot about how I many years ago, before Rola, before 20 years ago, I was working in independent film, and it's still sort of an independent film model on this, you know, there's an independence that you can create out of co-productions, which I think is exciting, you know, and it is, you are putting together financing almost like an independent film. And it creates it creates, I think, breathing room for certain types of thinking and certain types of talent, and you know, which I find incredible. I hope is valuable.
I think it's very telling about the dynamic in the industry right now is that this conversation hasn't been about, oh my God, you bring 3 partners together and one person's whining about the casting and one person wants to not, you know, like it's the conversation says, even with all the public health drama, the conversation is all about opportunity. I think that speaks volumes. We've got a couple questions here from the audience. One is very specific. Specifically, have you needed specific insurance for COVID, and how have you dealt with securing that? And has that been have you had to secure special COVID insurance if you have had to do so?
We've done it as ongoing part of the ongoing insurance. But it's really complex. And lots of exclusions. But if there's very specific COVID insurance out there, then I'd love to hear about it. But I don't think I don't know about it if there is.
Okay, gotcha. Anybody else have any experience with insurance one way or another?
I mean, it's varied by territory for us, but you know, to Jane's point, it's very complicated. Lots of exclusions. It has increased the risk for the studios. It's just inevitable. You know, if you're lucky if you're shooting somewhere where there's a lot of government backing.
Government backing for healthcare support.
Yeah, well, or just for shutdowns and that sort of thing.
Gotcha. Another listener here is asking, can you name some specific countries that offer really generous incentives for production, for shooting?
Belgium.
Belgium, yes.
South Africa, a lot of Eastern European countries. I mean, Latvia, Lithuania, Britain. If you're
United Kingdom.
United Kingdom.
United Kingdom, yeah. We're about to start shooting in the Canaries just after the new year. Very open, huge incentive. Yeah, Belgium works, Brussels works amazingly well for Paris. So,
yeah,
the tricks you learn. Let me go. Our time is coming to an end. Let me just round robin real quick. Tell us something, a project, a talent, a idea, something from your shop or your company that we should be looking out for in the new year, or something you're excited about. Give us a flavor of something you're working on.
There you go, Cynthia. You're reverting to type. You see, it's always the same.
Well, the one that we at the moment, it's on a streamer, and it's not fully funded by the streamer, is the World of Calm project, which is a crazy project connected with the app, the mindfulness app. And that was like the idea that you can do a show which is kind of basically designed to make you fall asleep before the end of it was kind of so nuts. And talk about something which you could never, ever have sold to a terrestrially based broadcaster. And it's selling throughout the world. And so World of Calm just shows how crazy you can make things in these crazy times, for us anyway.
That's awesome. Thank you, Jane. Christian?
Yeah, we actually are going into production in the new year on a mini series that we've done with Michael Winterbottom about the first 5 months of the Boris Johnson premiership. We've announced the show. We will be announcing cast and network soon, but it's with Tim Shipman from the Times of London. It's amazing. I mean, having lived through it all, and then you look back at it, the absurdity of every day of the last, number of years, frankly, in England, it's really fun.
Christian, I really want to see it right now.
Yeah, the scripts are, you laugh through the tears. It's very good.
Oh, we will watch out for that. Rola, I know you are still in your infancy at MGM, but I also know you probably have 50 projects going by now.
Well, I'm not allowed to go in and announce any of them. I will say that there are a number of them that I'm quite excited about. We're also working, developing, and putting together projects with a company that MGM owns, a sister company called Epix, which is a platform, as you know, and that's very exciting because they're open to European narrative and have done very well. Gareth, one of them that was very successful for them that you had. And
Gareth Belgravia is running on Epix, the pay channel. A really good costume drama.
I really echo you, Rola, because we had a fantastic experience working with Epix and Michael Wright.
Well, oh my God, do I have witnesses that Gareth Neame may work with me? To have a moment here?
Y'all heard it.
Yeah.
All right, great.
Or just say that's, there are some projects that we're going to be announcing European lens onto American narrative. And that's always interesting when you mix and match that combination.
For sure. Gareth, I was sorry to hear that 4 days out you were so close to Gilded Age. I've been very curiously watching this project and its many incarnations over the years.
Well, I'm sorry that we can't have you on the set, Cynthia, because as you know, no visitors are allowed on any sets now. But all I can say that show to see, they've built the Upper East Side in Long Island, and it really looks fantastic. So it's a very exciting project.
Looking forward to that. But that's with Julian Fellows of Downton Abbey fame. Really looking forward to that. Well, thank you all so much. This has been a really interesting hour talking about the ins and outs and the dynamics of the international television business, the co-production business. All of you have so much knowledge all right up here. Thank you so much for taking an hour to share it with us. And before we wrap up this PGA, this co-production itself, this panel is a co-production of the Producers Guild of America and the Monte-Carlo Television Festival. And in the spirit of optimism, we want to encourage people to think about attending the Monte-Carlo Festival, June 18th through the 22nd, in a beautiful spot in the world. And we're all just going to think positive and hope that we can, in fact, do it in person. Go vaccines. Thank you so much, everyone, for your time. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was great.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.